Alright, hopefully we should be streaming now. I'm still trying to figure out this software. And I'm trying to figure out exactly how this is working. As you can see, we have a change of scenery here. This is, we went to the tree farm today and decorated for Christmas, and this is just a branch I picked up off of the ground. And I was like, can I have this? And he was like, yeah. So that was a fun story. That isn't what we're reading today. But no, we're starting with chapter 7 of Wicked Lovely by Melissa Marr. I hope you guys are enjoying it if you've been following it along. If not, I'm going to do a short summary for you here. I hope you have tea and blankets. It is the chilly season across the globe for the northern hemisphere. So yeah. So where were we? What just happened? Yes. So, where we left off, Aslan has been kind of claimed by the Summer Court and by Keenan, the king of the Summer Fairies, and she doesn't know it yet. And she's one of the few people who can see fairies, and she keeps this very secret for fear of being hurt by fairies, because they're not all, or mostly even, nice people, or people. But she is at school, and she just saw Keenan's best friend, Dead Girl, outside of the school hanging out with her wolf. And that's where we pick up. Alright. Chapter 7. Hello? Leslie snapped her fingers in front of Aslan's face. Her silver nail polish catching Aslan's attention. Are you coming or not? What? To Dom's, Leslie sighed, a familiar look of irritation on her face. Beside them, Carla smothered a laugh. Leslie exhaled noisily, blowing her 2 long bangs away from her face. You weren't listening to a word I said, were you? Hold up, Rianne yelled as she ran down the steps. Like Leslie, Rianne already had her blazer off, but she also had the top 2 buttons of her blouse undone. It was all show, but it was show that led to lectures from more than a few of the faculty at Bishop O.C. From the side of the building, Father Edwin called, You're still on school property, ladies. Not now. Rianne stepped off the curb and onto the street and blew a kiss at him. See you tomorrow, Father. Father Edwin tugged at his Roman collar, his version of clearing his throat. Try to stay out of trouble. Yes, Father, Leslie said obediently. She then lowered her voice. So are you coming, Ash? She didn't pause, walking toward the corner, expecting everyone to follow her. Aslan shook her head. I'm meeting Seth at the library. Now he's yummy, Rianne gave an exaggerated sigh. You holding out on us? Les said that's why you bailed the other night. Across the street, listening to everything they said, was Dead Girl. She followed them, her wolf lopping down the street, keeping pace with them. We're friends, Aslan blushed, feeling more embarrassed than usual with fairy eavesdropping. Aslan stopped, bent down, and pulled off her shoe as if there was something in it. She glanced back. Dead Girl and her wolf lingered in the shadows of the alley across the street. Humans walked past, oblivious as always, talking, laughing, completely unaware of the unnaturally large wolf and its feral rider. I bet you could be more. Rianne linked her arm through Aslan's and urged her forward. Don't you think, Les? Leslie smiled, slowly and deliberately. From what I hear, he's got enough experience to be a prime candidate for the job. Trust me, for your first, you'd want someone with finesse. In a throaty voice, Rianne said, and I hear Seth's got finesse. Carla and Leslie laughed. Aslan shook her head. Shayla said that when she was in Father E's office, she saw the new student who's coming in this week. Some orphan. Carla said that they stood at the crosswalk. Said he's definitely a high-cal dessert. Orphan? She really said orphan? Leslie rolled her eyes. Glad the conversation drifted away from her, Aslan only half listened, more concerned with her fairy stalker than the new students. The fairy stayed precisely even with them as they walked. From the way the fairies that passed treated Dead Girl, she was special. None of them approached her. Some of them bowed their heads as she passed. She, however, didn't acknowledge any of them. At the corner of Edge Hill and Vine, where they usually split ways, Carla asked again, "You sure? You could bring him." "What?" Aslan shook her head. "No. Seth's helping me study. For government. I'll call you later." The light changed, and she started across the street, calling back, "Have fun!" Dead girl didn't follow. Maybe she went away. "Hey, Ash," Leslie called once they were far enough apart that she had to yell, far enough that everyone would hear. "You do know that there's no test in there this month." Rand shook her finger. "Naughty, naughty." The people walking by didn't pay any attention, but Aslan's face still burned. Whatever. Aslan cut across the park towards the library, thinking about Seth, about Dead Girl following her. She wasn't paying much attention to her surroundings until someone, a human someone, grabbed her arm and pulled her against his chest, holding her securely immobile. "Well, if it isn't a nice little Catholic girl. Nice skirt." He tugged her pleated skirt, and the other two guys with him laughed. "What you doing, baby?" Aslan tried to kick him, but her foot made little impact on his leg. "Stop it!" "Stop it," his friends mocked. "Oh no, stop it! Where is everyone? The park isn't usually this deserted this early. No people, no fairies. No one at all in sight." She opened her mouth to scream, and he clamped his hand over her jaw, his index finger between her half-open lips. She bit down. It tasted like old cigarettes. "Bitch." But he didn't remove his hand. He squeezed tighter until the inside of her cheek was pushed so tightly against her teeth that it bled. The guy to her right laughed. "Guess she likes it a little rough, huh?" Aslan felt tears in her eyes. The arm around her was bruisingly tight. Hand over her mouth squeezed again. She could taste fresh blood in her mouth. She tried to think, to remember what she knew about self-defense. Use whatever you can. Scream. Go limp. She did, letting her weight drop. He just shifted his hold. Then she heard a growl. Beside her was Dead Girl's wolf, teeth bared, and looked like a big dog, but Aslan knew what he was. Plainly visible to everyone and looking deceptively human, Dead Girl stood holding the wolf's leash, letting him close enough to the three losers that it wouldn't take much of a lunge to draw blood. Her voice was frighteningly calm. "Remove your hands." The two guys who weren't holding Aslan backed away, but the one holding her said, "Not your business, Blondie. Keep walking." The fairy waited for a moment, and then she shrugged and let go of the leash. "So be it. Sasha, arm." The wolf, Sasha, ripped a gash in the guy's wrist. He shrieked and let go of Aslan, clamping his bleeding arm. She dropped to the ground. Without another word, they ran, all three of them. The wolf sprinted behind them, nipping at their legs as they went. Dead Girl crouched down. Her expression was unreadable as she asked, "Are you able to stand?" "Why did you—" Aslan flinched away as Dead Girl reached out toward her chin. "Thank you." Dead Girl winced at the words. "I don't know what happened." Aslan stared in the direction they'd run. Huntsdale wasn't a bad city, maybe a bit rough in the late hours. Maybe the lack of jobs and excess of bars made it wise to skip too many shortcuts through dark alleys late at night. Still, any sort of attack in the park, it was beyond odd. She caught the fairy's gaze and whispered, "Why?" At first the Dead Girl didn't answer, then avoiding the question, she reached out her hand slowly. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." "Why were—" Aslan stopped, bit her lip, and stood. "I'm Dania. Ash." She offered a shaky smile. "Come then, Ash." Dania started toward the library, staying beside her, not touching, but too close for comfort. Aslan stopped in front of one of the columns that stood on either side of the door. "Shouldn't you go find your, dog?" "No, Sasha will come back." Dania offered what would be a comforting smile if she were human. Then she motioned toward the door. "Come." Aslan opened the ornate wooden door, starting to calm down. The door to the library, like the columns, was at odds with the nondescript architecture that dominated Huntsdale. It was as if some city father had decided that they needed one beacon of beauty among the otherwise dingy structures. She felt like laughing, not in amusement, but at the growing sense that the rules she'd lived by were suddenly off. It wasn't fairies that attacked her, but humans. Rule number 1, don't ever attract fairies' attention. She had, though, and if she hadn't, what would have happened outside? Aslan's feet felt heavy. Her stomach lurched. "Do you need to sit?" Donnie was gentle, steering Aslan toward the hallway where the restrooms were. "It's frightening, what they did." "I feel foolish," Aslan whispered. "Nothing happened, not really." "Sometimes the threat of a thing is awful enough." Donnie shrugged. Go wash your face. You'll feel better. Alone inside the tiny bathroom, Aslan washed the blood from her face and felt her side. She'd have a bruise where his fingers dug into her skin. Her already dry lip had split. All things considered, it wasn't bad. It could have been, though. Aslan washed her face again and straightened her hair. She tugged off her uniform, balling it up and shoving it into her bag, and slipped into a well-worn pair of jeans and a long tunic-cut blouse that she'd found at a thrift store. Then she stepped back into the seemingly empty hallway, letting the bathroom door close softly behind her. Dania stood, invisible now, talking to one of the Bone Girls. Like the rest of the Bone Girls, this one was ghastly white and so thin that each of her bones could be seen under her almost translucent skin. The fact that she was mobile seemed to break some basic law. Surely things that looked so frail had to have trouble moving. But the Bone Girls glided over the ground without any visible effort. Despite their cavernous mane, they were eerily beautiful to watch. It was Dania who was terrible to behold. Her white hair whipped around as if a storm surrounded her, and only her. Tiny icicles clattered to the ground beside her. Find them. Find out why they attacked the girl. If anyone compelled them to do so, I want to know now. Aslan is not to be harmed. The Bone Girl's voice was a dry whisper, as if the words had to rush over something rough before they found form. Should I tell Keenan? Dania didn't answer, but her eyes darkened to the same oil-black sheen they had at comics. The Bone Girl stepped back, hands held up in supplication, and Dania stepped around the corner, away from the Bone Girl and out of sight. Momentarily, though, she came back around that same corner, plainly visible to humans now, and smiled at Aslan. All better? Aslan's voice wasn't much louder than the Bone Girl's had been when she answered. Sure, I'm fine. She wasn't fine, though. She was confused about so many things. They, Keenan and Dania, had some reason for following her, but she couldn't ask. Are they just bored? Toying with me to pass the time? There were lots of old stories like that, but Dania seemed livid about the guys outside. Seemed to believe that someone could have sent those guys to hurt her. Why? What's going on? I was just reading while I waited. I wanted to see if you had someone to walk you home before I leave. Dania tilted her head, smiling. Her whole posture seemed friendly, safe. She walked back toward the rows of tables. Ash? Are you well? Yeah, Aslan followed Dania around the corner to a table with an open book and a ragged bag. Is there someone you can call? Yeah, I'm good. Dania nodded. She stuffed her book into her leather bag. The door opened, and a mother with a couple of kids came in. Behind them was a group of fairies, invisible to the other patrons. All 6 were beautiful, moving like models, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been tailored for their willowy bodies. If it weren't for the flowering vines slithering across their skin, they'd look human. If the vines, though, were like living tattoos, moving of their own volition, crawling on the girls' bodies. One of the girls spun across the floor in some old-fashioned dance. The other girls giggled and bowed to one another before following her. Then the first one saw Dania. She murmured something to the others, and they stopped. Even the undulating vines stilled. Several moments passed. Dania didn't say a word, neither did Aslan. Since we're both pretending not to see them, what would we say? Finally, Aslan said, if you hadn't been there. What? The expression on Dania's face was pained as she looked away from the fairies. Outside, if you hadn't been there. But I was. She smiled, but there was a drawn look on her face, making her seem anxious, eager to leave. Right, I need to find someone. Aslan motioned toward the stairs that led to the library basement. Get something, but I wanted to say thanks for everything. Dania shot a brief glare at the fairies, who were giggling again. Just be sure to keep your someone with you when you leave. Will you do that? Sure. Good, I'll catch you around sometime, under better circumstances, I'm sure. Then Dania smiled. The fairy was beautiful, stunning, the way that a storm is when you wake up and see lightning streak across the sky. And probably just as dangerous. Chapter 8. A Cornish woman who... by the way, if you're ever interested in picking up this book, each one of the chapters... I haven't been reading these. Camera. Each one of the chapters starts with one of these, excerpts from a classic tale. Ugh. I'm so bad with this because it's backwards. But yeah, each one starts with a classic excerpt from the tale that Melissa Marr actually pulled a lot of this her basis off of for the fairies. So if you're ever interested in like looking into all of that, you can, if this book is really fascinating to you. But I'm skipping over those because it's not a part of the story. Actually, kind of gives you a little bit of a spoiler, so I've been doing it on purpose. But anyway, chapter 8. Aslan stood motionless, gazing in the direction of the vanishing fairy. In that brief moment, Dania had been so devastatingly lovely that Aslan felt near tears. Seth came up behind her. She knew it was him before he slipped his arms around her, but she wasn't sure how she knew. She just did. There were a lot of things like that lately, knowing stuff without any reason why. It was kind of creepy. He whispered, "Who's she?" "What?" It's hard to whisper back to him when he stood behind her. He was almost a foot taller than she was. "Her, the one you were talking to." He inclined his head in the direction Dania had gone. She wasn't sure how to answer, but when she turned, Seth saw her face, and he no longer seemed to care about his unanswered question. "What happened?" He stared at her swollen lip, reached out as if he'd touch it. "Tell you everything at home?" She hugged him. She didn't want to think about it, not now. She just wanted to leave, go to Seth's where she could feel safer. "Let me grab my notes." Then he walked away, right past the group of fairies headed toward Aslan. One of the fairy girls circled behind her. "She's the new one." A second one stroked a hand over Aslan's hair. "Pretty thing." Another shrugged. "I suppose." Oh, sorry, one sec. My computer sent me an alert. Is everything still... Seems like it's going okay. My computer just sent me an alert that something was wrong with my computer, but... Alright. Everything seems to be running alright. But... yeah. We'll find out later, I guess. I'm still learning how to do this. Anyway. Let me grab my notes. Then he walked away, right past the group of fairies headed towards Aslan. One of the fair girls circled behind her. "She's the new one." A second one stroked a hand over Aslan's hair. "Pretty thing." Another shrugged. "I suppose." Aslan tried to keep her face blank. Focus. She concentrated on the rustling leaves against the girl's clothes, not the strange, sugary sweet scent that seemed to pervade the air around them, not the too hot brush of their skin as they inspected her with their hands. It wasn't comfortable at all. But after the fiasco outside, their touch somehow seemed less awful. The violence of the three guys. She shuddered. The fairies chattered back and forth, louder now that Dania had left, and presumably no one in the library could hear them. "The winter girl seems to be making progress. This one's a no-touch now." "Who cares? I'm not fond of girls." "Now her friend, he's touchable. Tasty." They giggled. "Maybe she'll share once she joins us." "If she's the one, she won't have a choice, will she? Her friend will be free game." As Seth walked back toward her, a bag slung over his shoulder, Aslan held out both hands where he could see them, like she was holding her arms open for another hug. He gave her a questioning look. "Who says we need to wait?" One of the fairies stroked his cheek, another pinched him. Seth's eyes widened. Aslan's heart thumped. He felt it. She never had to try to speak so the fairies didn't understand her, not with anyone but Grams. Not with anyone who couldn't see them. Hoping the fairies were as daft as they looked, she slid her arm around his waist and tugged him toward the door, away from the vicious fairies. "Ready to go home?" "Definitely." He sped up a little and draped an arm over her shoulders. "The Summer King might have some competition." "You want to tell him that?" "Oh, Keenan love. Her toy is yummy." "Don't be mean. The king's good fun." They all giggled again. "How much fun will he be with her around?" "You know how he gets." "I'll volunteer to distract the mortal so Keenan can woo her." Me too. Look at all those rings in his face. Wonder if he has a tongue ring." Once they were safely within the metal framework of Seth's train, Aslan let out a breath. The walkover had been some medieval gauntlet with fairies watching and easing closer to them. They hadn't touched her, not once, but Seth would have more than a few unexplained bruises the next morning. She was glad he couldn't see them. She hugged him, just a quick embrace before stepping away. "I'm sorry." "For what?" He uncoiled Boomer from the tea kettle and lowered him into the terrarium. "For them." She hopped up on a counter. Seth flicked on the switch for the power strip, turning on the warming rock and heat lamps for Boomer. "Tea?" "Sure." "Did you feel them?" Maybe, he paused, swished water around the tea kettle. At the library there was something. Tell me about before that first. About that, he gestured toward her bruised face. So, she told him. She told him about the guys outside the library, about Dania's rescue, and for fury afterward when she talked to the bone girl. She let her words tumble out, not holding back anything. For several tense moments he stood there. His voice was strained when he asked, "You okay?" "Yeah, nothing happened, not really. Just scared me, I'm good." And she was. Seth, however, looked like he was struggling to stay calm. His jaw was clamped tightly shut, his features were tense. He'd turned away from her. Well, he tried to relax, but she knew him too well for it to work. "Seriously, I'm fine," she assured him. "My face hurts where he grabbed me, but it wasn't a big deal. When she was younger, she'd seen a group of fairies drag a delicate-looking fairy into a copse of trees in the park. The fairy had screamed, awful shrieking sounds that echoed in Aslan's nightmares for months. Being grabbed and held against her will for a few short minutes wasn't anywhere near what could happen. Dania saved me before it could turn into anything bad," she told him again. "I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you," he broke off, an unfamiliar panic in his eyes. It didn't, though. She wished she could erase his worry. So she changed the subject. "Now about your fairy encounters." He nodded, accepting her implicit need to change the topic. "How about we both write down what happened? Why? So I know it's not in my imagination or your suggestions." He seemed unsure, and she couldn't blame him. She couldn't avoid the Fae. He could. He had a choice. Something she'd never had with them. She took the pen and pad he offered and wrote, "Pinched ass library, patted cheek library, licked neck, corner of Willow Ave, poked, prodded, and tripped, 6th Street, Joe's Deli, crosswalk by Keeley's house, under bridge." She looked up, and Seth was staring at her growing list. He flipped his paper over so she could see it. "Pinched at the library, shoved, ? Outside of the deli, stumbled under the bridge, ? She let him take her still unfinished list. "So, fairies, huh?" He smiled, but not like he was happy. "How come I felt it?" "Maybe because you're aware of the possibility now. I don't know." She took a deep breath, knowing that she should tell him to get away before they focused on him too much was one thing. Going back to being alone in this was something totally different. He deserved it, though, the chance to get away from the awfulness of the fairies while he could. "You know, you can still tell me to go away. Pretend none of this happened. I'd understand." He poked his tongue at the silver ring in his bottom lip. "Why would I do that?" "Because they're touching you." She blew out her breath in a huff and scooted further back onto the counter. "You know it now. You felt them." "It's worth it." He picked up the tea kettle, but he didn't fill it. He just looked at her. "I thought they did stuff like that anyhow." "Yeah, but you felt it more, and they were all staring at you. Something's changed now that those two are following me." She didn't try to hide the worry or fear in her voice. If he was going to know about them, he deserved the truth of how afraid she really was. He filled the tea kettle and came over to stand in front of her. She wrapped her arms around him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there earlier," he whispered, holding her tightly to him. She didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say. If she told him about the things she'd seen over the years, it would make him worry more. If she let herself think about what could have happened, she might freak out. She didn't want to think about it, about what could have happened, about why they grabbed her. Finally, she pulled back a little and told Seth about the fairies at the library who'd been circling her and talking about him. Then she asked, "So what do you think?" He wrapped a long strand of her hair around his finger and stared at her. "About tongue rings?" "About fairies' comments," she corrected, blushing. She slid forward like she was going to hop off the counter. "They seem to know what's going on. Maybe you could see if there's anything about groups of Rian-like fairies. You know, ones that are overly shallow and, Seth? Instead of moving back to give her room, Seth had stepped forward, pushing slightly against her knees. "You need to move if I'm going to get down from here." She sounded breathless, not at all like herself, and it felt good, much better than the worries that she had been trying to avoid. Much better than thinking about the bad things she avoided, or the fairy that saved her, or them noticing Seth. Seth ignored her comment, staying perfectly still. She didn't move or push him back. She could have. Instead, she asked, "What do you think?" He lifted one eyebrow, staring at her as he did. You can never have too many piercings. She opened her knees, putting one on either side of his ribs, thinking thoughts that she couldn't about him. That's... What? He didn't move any further, didn't close the distance between them. He might tease, flirt, but he didn't pursue her. It was her choice. In a world where so many choices weren't hers, this was a wonderful feeling. That's not what I meant. She blushed again and felt foolish for flirting back. She couldn't let it get weird. A one-nighter would mess up their friendship. She was just riding some post-danger rush. She scooted backwards. Promise you'll tell me if anything happens when I'm not there. He stepped away then, giving her room. She slid down. Her legs felt wobbly. I don't like the fairies paying so much attention to you. He poured them each a cup of tea and opened a tin of shortbread cookies. Then he put on his glasses and pulled out a stack of photocopies and books. She picked up her tea and followed him to the sofa, glad to be back on comfortable ground. His knee bumped against her leg as he sorted out his papers. Well, not entirely glad. One way to protect yourself is iron or steel, which you already knew. He gestured at his walls. I like knowing I sleep somewhere safe, but I'm going to stop buying pins and needles just to get steel rings to replace the titanium ones. Unless... He paused and turned to stare at her. You think the tongue ring's a good idea. Seriously, I could do that. He watched her, an expectant look on his face now, like he was waiting for her to say something. She couldn't. She blushed even brighter than before. He's still teasing to distract me. It had worked too well. She bent down on her lip and looked away. Right, well, supposedly sacred symbols work too, a cross, especially an iron one, and holy water. He set that page aside and picked up a book with passages marked by brightly colored sticky notes. He thumbed through them, summarizing. Spread churchyard dirt in front of them. Bread and salt are also good protections, but I'm not sure what you're going to do with them. Spread them like the dirt. Throw them. Aslan got up to pace. He glanced up at her and then turned back to the marked passages. Turn your clothes inside out to hide from them. It makes you look like someone else to them. Plants and herbs that work as counter charms. Four-leafed clover. St. John's wort. Red verbena. They all help you see through glamour. He put that book aside and ate a cookie, staring past her at nothing, waiting. Aslan flopped back down on the sofa, farther away from him than she'd normally sit. I don't know, I can't see walking around with my clothes inside out all the time, and I don't know what about throwing bread at them. What am I supposed to do, carry bagels and toast everywhere? Salt's easier. He laid the pages on one of the side tables and got up. Excuse me. Need more tea. He laid one of the pages on the side table and got up. He pulled open a drawer on the plastic cupboards stacked in the corner. After rummaging around for a minute, he held up a handful of packets of salt. Here, extras from all the takeout. Stuff these in your pockets. He tossed some to her and put a few in his pocket too, just in case. Does it say how much salt and what to do with it? Sprinkle it on them? Toss it at them? I don't know. Didn't see anything in this book, but I'll follow up on that one too. I ordered some books from the interlibrary loan. He came back to the table and scrawled a note on one of the pages. No, what about the herbs? I can pick some up. Any ideas on which ones? I can already see them, Zeth, she said impatiently. She caught herself, took a deep breath, and grabbed a cookie from the tin beside her. Why would I need herbs? I might be more help if I can see them too. He wrote another note. Look for more recipes. Paste, tea, how to use herbs for sight, chamomile tea for ash. Chamomile? Helps you relax. He leaned over and stroked her hair soothingly, pausing to let his hand rest on the back of her neck. It helped. You're snapping at me. Sorry, she frowned. I thought I was keeping it together, but today, if Tanya hadn't been there, but that's the thing, she shouldn't have been there. I've seen them my whole life, but they've never paid attention to me. Now it's like they've all stopped whatever they were doing before to watch me. It's never been like this. He stood there, twirling one of the studs in his ear, staring at her. Then he grabbed the book and sat down in the chair across from her. Wearing daisies is supposed to keep kids safe from fairy kidnapping. I don't know if the daisies work once you aren't a kid. He dropped off that one and flipped open the last book. Carry a staff of rowan wood. If they chase you, leap over running water, especially if it's flowing south. There's one river here, and I don't see me jumping over it unless I sprout springs in my feet. None of this helps much. She hated how whiny she sounded. What do I do with the staff? Hid them? And wouldn't they know I saw them if I did these things? Seth took his glasses back off and sat them on top of a stack of books on the floor. He rubbed his eyes. I'm trying, Ash. It's only the first day I looked. We'll find out more. What if I don't have time? The rules are changing, and I don't know why. I need to do something now. She shuddered, remembering the strange stillness of the fairies when she passed them. It was frightening. Like what? He sounded calm. The more anxious she got, the calmer he sounded. Find them. Talk to the two that started it. Keenan and Danya put her hand over her mouth and took several breaths. Calm down. It didn't help much. He leaned back in his chair, rocking it so that he teetered on the back legs. You sure that's a good idea? Especially after those guys? She interrupted. Court fairies, are following me, and what they could do is a whole lot worse. They want something, and I don't like being the only one who doesn't know what it is. She stopped, thinking about what the fairies at the library had said. The fairies, when they weren't lusting on you, called the Keenan the Summer King. His chair thunked down, back on all four legs. He's a king? Maybe. He looked worried then. A flash of something like panic crossed his face, but he nodded. I'll see what I can find out about that title tomorrow. I'd planned to check online while I can wait on the other books. Sounds good, she smiled, trying to keep her own panic in check, not wanting to think about the possibility that not just court fae, but a fairy king was following her. Seth watched her the way that you watch a person standing on a ledge, not sure if they're going to go over or not. He didn't ask her to think further on that dangerous possibility, didn't ask her to talk about it. Instead, he asked, Are you staying to eat? No. She got up, rinsed her cup, and took another deep breath, tucking her hands into her pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking. She turned, and before she could back down, told him, I think I'm going to see what's out there walking tonight. Maybe one of them will say something like the ones at the library. Come with me? Just a sec. Seth opened an old steamer trunk labeled textbooks and pulled out several cigar boxes of jewelry. Inside were leather bracelets with big metal rings, delicate cameos, and velvety jeweler's boxes. As he rummaged through the cigar boxes, he sat several pieces to the side, including one of the leather wristbands. He dug around a little longer and pulled out a can of pepper spray. For humans, but maybe it works on fairies too. I don't know. Seth, just stuff it in your pockets with the salt. He grinned and then held up a necklace with a bracelet of thick chain links, very much his style. Steel, it's supposed to burn them or maybe just weaken them. I know, but look, it makes sense to use whatever you can, right? When she nodded, he came over and motioned for her to turn around. He brushed her hair to the side, piling it over her shoulder. Hold that. Silently she did. It felt weird, too close after that earlier tension, but she stood there while Seth draped a necklace around her throat. Maybe he's right. Maybe she could use whatever help she could get. The idea of looking for fairies went against every rule she'd ever learned, but she was going to try it. Going to do it, to try it. It was better than waiting. I need to try something, do something. Even now, she could see more fairies outside the window. One was perched on the top ledge of a hedge that couldn't possibly hold him up, but did. Seth hooked the heavy chain around her throat, let it fall against her skin, then he kissed the back of her neck and walked past her to the door. Let's go. Chapter 9. I'm going to drink more tea. My throat's a little sore. Had it up. Alright, Chapter 9. As she tried to make sense of the earlier events, why would mortals attack Ash? Was it mere chance? Danya walked. She passed the vagrants leaning against the faded red brick buildings, the group of young men with their too loud comments on her assets, the uncontrolled exchange of cash for crack between two skinny guys. In all Danya's decades, Bria had never broken the rules. No one knew why, but there was plenty of speculation. Centuries past, Bria had meted out especially cruel punishments when a group of winter fae had tampered with the game. No one interferes. But the odds of the park being clear of all fae, it couldn't be random. Either Bria willed it or allowed it. As Dania walked, she let the glamour fade away, becoming once more invisible to the mortals. Unfortunately, she couldn't hide from the Fae as easily. She fought to keep her voice even, but it never seemed to work with Keenan. Today, even less so than usual. What do you want? Happiness, Berea to grow a conscience, forgiveness. He leaned in to kiss her cheek. She moved out of reach, stepping into a puddle. Can't help you. Not even on the forgiveness? Absently, he blew a gentle breeze toward a couple of shivering crackheads, not changing his stride as he did so. She kept her silence, debating how much she could omit without lying. He was impatient as always, though, questioning her before she could get her thoughts sorted. Did you see her? Yes. Talk to her? He held out a hand to carry her bag. Always solicitous, even now with his eyes glimmering over thoughts of her, Aslan. Dania clutched the strap of her bag, then felt foolish for being petty, and held it out. Sasha ran toward her at full speed, bounding over the debris. His tail... Sorry, my stuttering's getting bad. His tail was held high when he came to a stop beside her. Good boy. She bent to ruffle his hair and check for any blood on his muzzle before continuing down the street. Across the street, several of Keenan's guardsmen kept a discreet distance, winding their way around the people, leaning into the crumbling facades of buildings in this part of the city, and somehow still managing to keep the edges of their long coats from dragging through any of the filth on the ground. With a shake of her head, she looked back at Keenan, and he smiled at her. For an instant, she forgot everything. His betrayal, her suspicions about Berea, the aching cold. He is as beautiful as he was when we met. I look pale and awful, but he's gorgeous. She tore her gaze away and walked faster. He stayed beside her, adjusting his stride to match hers. Dania? Did you? I spoke with her. She thought again about what had almost happened, about what could have happened if she hadn't been there. She didn't tell him. The girl's kind. Good. Totally too good for you. So were you... Oh, sorry. So were you. He kissed her cheek and singed it with his lips. You still are. Bastard, she shoved him, ignoring the burning in her palm from touching him. He put a hand on his shoulder, melting the ice that formed where she'd pushed him too hard. It cracked under his touch. Only because Berea murdered my father. Keenan kept pace with Dania until they reached the mouth of a barricaded alley. She said nothing, offered him nothing in the way of even the barest civility. Even after all these years, it still hurt to see the disdain on her face. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. You saw Berea. She didn't answer him, but it wasn't a question. What did she want? He prompted. She stepped around him, going farther toward the railroad yard. Nothing I can't handle. She was hiding something, but he could see the tightening in her hands, hear her breathing catch just a little. He followed. Seems odd for her to just stop by to visit. I didn't think you enjoyed being around her. It's not much worse than seeing you. But somehow I endure that. She stopped and leaned against one of the fire-blackened buildings outside of the railroad yard. Closing her eyes and breathing deeply, Sasha stretched out at her feet. Since she'd been mortal once, being that close to iron wasn't as hard for her as it was for most Fae, but it still hurt her. If it hurt Sasha, she wouldn't come, but the wolf was immune to it. The guards were keeping their distance, but even being near that much iron had to be painful for them. Keenan motioned for them to pull back farther. Dania? He reached out to take her hand, but didn't. His touch would hurt her more than the iron did. Instead, he splayed his arms out on the wall. I think we ran through that playlist. Alright. Cool. Cool. Better. This vibe isn't right, sorry. I'm just gonna loop that same playlist. Alright. The guards were keeping their distance, but even being near that much iron had to be painful for them. Keenan motioned for them to pull back further. Dania, he reached out to take her hand but didn't. His touch would hurt her more than the iron did. Instead, he splayed his arms out on the wall on either side of her, palms covering the part of the graffiti on the wall, making a prison of sorts with his arms. Why did you come down here? To remind myself of what I lost. She opened her eyes, holding his gaze. To remind myself not to trust any of you? She was utterly impossible. He grimaced at her accusing look, at the decades-long argument. I didn't lie to you. You didn't tell me the truth either. She closed her eyes again. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Her cold breath mingled with his equally warm breath in the small space between them, rising like steam above them. Go away, Keenan. I don't like you any more today than I did yesterday, or the day before that, He interrupted. But I still like you. That's the beauty of this, isn't it? I still miss you. Every single time we do this, Don. He lowered his voice to try to hide how close it was to raw. I miss you. She didn't even open her eyes to look at him. Any love she might have felt died decades ago. If things were different, but they weren't. He shook his head. Dania wasn't her. She was one of the girls he'd never have. He needed to think about how to get close to Aslan, not about the one he'd lost and loved. He sighed. Are you going to tell me what Berea wanted? Dania did look at him then, leaning her face close enough that he felt her words on his lips. Berea wants the same thing that you do. Me to do her bidding. He took several steps back. Damn it, Dania. I don't want... Stop. Just stop. She pushed away from the building. She wants me to convince Aslan not to trust you. Just a little pep talk in case I forgot my job. She was hiding something. Berea wouldn't visit her for that alone. Evan, the Rowanman, who'd watched over Dania, said she was terrified when Berea left. Terrified. But she didn't trust him enough to tell him why. And why should she? He started to follow her to try again. Please. Her voice wavered. Not today. Just leave me alone today. Then she walked away, closer to the railroad yard, as close as she could stand without collapsing. And then there was nothing he could do to stop her, to help her. So he watched her until she ducked behind a wall, and he couldn't see her anymore. By nightfall, Dania was composed again, but being down at the railroad yard had made her tired. So she stopped to rest by the fountain on Willow, a block over from Aslan's house. She'd sent Sasha out to run, unwilling to ask the wolf to stay when he wanted to roam. The harsh streetlights reflected on the surface of the fountain, casting plum shadows in the courtyard. An old man with a well-loved sax played for the people who passed. Dania stretched her legs out on the bench, relishing the shadows, listening to the sax man and thinking. In talking to the Fae earlier, Donna had only learned that no one wanted to talk. Neither Berea's Winter Fae nor Ariel's Dark Fae, who worked closely with the Winter Court, would admit to involvement. The Solitary Fae would only say that they weren't comfortable in the park. The lack of answers was answer enough. By consent or directive, Berea had interfered. She thinks this girl is different. The sax man played another mournful song. Dania shifted again, stretching out further, enjoying her solitude, cherishing the belief. The sax man played another mournful song. Dania shifted again, stretching out further, enjoying her solitude, cherishing the brief illusion of belonging with humanity. She'd never be that again, human. She didn't belong to their world, never again would. It still ached when she thought of what she'd given up for Keenan. Once the next girl lifted the staff, she would become just another fairy. No allegiance to any of the courts, no responsibility, no place at all where she belonged. She still wanted that belonging. Once she'd thought she belonged with Keenan. When she met him, before she knew what he was, he'd taken her to hear his friend's band. He'd even bought her a dress, a short little number with strands of beads hanging everywhere, swaying when she danced. And did they dance? The band was unlike anything she'd heard before. 3 tall, thin men made love with the songs that they wrenched from their horns, while a woman with a sexy torch voice crooned to the crowd, promising everything with her words and her body. There were others, a heavy-set man with fingers that stroked the piano keys like he was caressing it. When they played, gods, it was like they funneled pure emotion into the instruments. Nothing had ever felt as good as listening to them play. Nothing except moving across the floor in Keenan's arms. Nothing ever would. Shaking off the longing, she closed her eyes, listening to the saxman in front of her. His song was flat compared to the fairy band in her memories, but blessedly mortal. There was no trickery in his song, no lie woven into the notes. It was flawed and somehow lovelier for it. She laughed out aloud and she laughed aloud at the absurdity of it all. She could hear the most perfect music any day, Faye with voices of unmatchable purity, but half-talented old man playing for change in the park pleased her more. From beside her she heard Aslan's voice, wary and thin, as the girl approached. Dania? She was wary, far more than Dania had ever been when the Winter Girl and Summer King had played her. She needs something to even the odds, especially if she's the one he's been seeking. We were walking by and saw you. Sasha's not here, so I thought, did he come back? Sasha's fine. Sit with me. Dania kept her eyes closed, but turned her head to smile in Aslan's direction. Aslan's mortal didn't speak, but Dania heard his steady heartbeat as he stood protectively by her side. Aslan started. We weren't. Stay, relax with me. We could both use it. And it was true. After Keenan whispered his hollow words, his protests and reminders of what they'd once had, what she couldn't have, she was always out of sorts. If it'd been true winter, he'd be unable to bother her, but spring through fall, he was out and about, tormenting her with his very presence. Never mind that he'd tempted her with empty promises. Forget the fact that he'd stolen her mortality. Until another girl was willing to believe in him, she was trapped, watching him make them fall in love with him, knowing that the girls who chose not to risk the cold shared his bed. They had all refused the risk, choosing instead to be summer girls, refusing to lift the staff. I loved him enough to risk the cold. They didn't. Yet they had him. Ash, the mortal, Seth, motioned to a group of equally pierced people who called out to him. I'll be right here. Aslan murmured to him with a weak smile. She folded her arms tightly over her chest. When you're ready. He looked like he'd rather stay beside Aslan, but she motioned him off, watching him as he passed the fountain. Inside it, young kelpies were playing. Like most of the water fae, they cared little for the other fairies in the park. They were still disquieting to Dania in a way most of the fae no longer were, preying on mortals when given the slightest chance, drinking it down their last breaths, somehow making death a sexual thing. Not even Iriel's dark court disturbed her in the way that the water fae did. Of course, Seth, like most mortals, didn't glance at them. But as he passed, they stilled, watching him with eerie hunger they had. They could see the passion in him, feel it somehow, or they wouldn't watch him so. Aslan watched him too. Her breathing sped up, her cheeks flushed. Her willingness to be separated from him seemed to be a show for his benefit. She didn't speak, didn't relax. Only a few minutes had passed when she announced, I can't stay here. Still feeling weird about the attack? Donnie felt pretty unsettled about it too, but for quite different reasons. If Berea knew Dania suspected her violating the rules, if Keenan knew that Dania suspected that his mortal was the missing Summer Queen, caught between them yet again, nothing was simple anymore. It hadn't been in so very long. Beside her, Aslan shuddered. She stared at the fountain, or perhaps past it where her mortal stood. I guess it freaked me out a little. Seems unreal, you know? And the sort of things that come out at night. Dania sat up. Things? It was an odd word to choose, an odd tone in her voice, as Aslan stared toward the kelpies. Can she see them? How very unexpected that would be. There were stories of sighted mortals, but Dania had never met one. With a strange, half-mocking tone, Aslan said, It's not just guys like those today. Even the pretty ones can be awful. Don't trust them because they're pretty. Dania laughed coldly, sounding every bit Berea's creature in that moment. Where were you when I needed that advice? I've already gone out with the biggest mistake a girl can make. Be sure to point him out to me if you see him around. Aslan stood up and slung her bag over her shoulder, and with that, Seth was already returning, attentive to Aslan's every move. Dania smiled at them, wishing someone waited for her like that, the way Keenan once had. Thanks again for the save. Aslan nodded then and walked off, headed straight toward the cavernous Scrimshaw sisters, who were gliding over the ground with their usual macabre beauty. She'll swerve if she can see them. She didn't. She kept walking forward until one of the Scrimshaw sisters drifted out of her path at the last possible second. Mortals don't see the Fae. Dania smiled wryly. If they did, Keenan would never have convinced any of them to trust him. Chapter 10. By the time she was far enough away from the fountain to feel comfortable about stopping, Aslan thought she was going to be sick. She leaned into Seth, knowing he'd wrap his arms around her. Her lips were against her ear when he asked, "More than meets the eye?" "Yeah." Seth held on to her, but he didn't say anything else. "What would I do without you?" She closed her eyes, not wanting to see the Vine girls or any of the other fairies who stood watching them. You'll never need to find out." He kept an arm around her shoulders as they started walking, past the place where the guys had grabbed her, past the omnipresent fairies with their crackled skin. Being more assertive sounded good in theory, but she'd need to learn to relax a lot more if she was going to be able to talk to fairies. Dania might have rescued her once, but that didn't change what she was. When they got to her building, Seth slipped money into her hand. "Take a taxi tomorrow." She didn't like accepting money from him, but she couldn't ask Grams for it without making her suspicious. She tucked it into her pocket. "You want to come up?" He lifted both eyebrows. "Pass." Aslan went upstairs, hoping Grams was asleep. Right now, avoiding those two observant eyes seemed like a good plan. She went inside and tried to walk past the living room. "You missed dinner again." Grams didn't take her eyes off the news. "Bad things out there, Aslan." "I know." She paused in the doorway of the living room, but she didn't go in. Graham sat in her bright purple lounger, feet propped up on the stone and steel coffee table. Her reading glasses hung by a chain around her neck. She might not be as young as she was in Aslan's childhood memories, but she still looked as fierce as she did then, still thin and healthier than many women her age. Even when she spent all day at home, she was dressed for the possibility of callers. Her long gray hair coiled up into a simple bun or contained in an intricate plait. Dressing gown traded in for a sedate skirt and blouse. Grams wasn't staid or sedate, though. She was uncommonly forward-thinking and entirely too clever when she paid attention. "Something happened?" Felt like a normal question, and if anyone heard, it'd sound like one, too. Always careful, that's the key to surviving among them. Still, Graham's strong voice had more than a thread of worry in it. "I'm fine, Graham's just tired." Aslan went in, leaned down, and kissed her. "I need to tell her, just not yet. She already worried too much." "You're wearing new steel." Grams eyed the necklace. Seth had given it to Aslan. Aslan stood there, wavering. "How much do I say?" Grams wouldn't understand or approve of Aslan taking an active approach to finding out what they wanted. Hide and look away. That was Graham's credo. "Aslan?" Grams turned up the volume on the news and grabbed a piece of paper. She wrote, "Have they done something? Are you hurt?" And held out the paper. "No." With a stern look, Grams pointed at the paper. Sighing, Aslan took the paper and pen. Using the coffee table as a desk, she wrote, "2 of them are following me." Grams sucked in her breath, quietly gasping. She snatched the paper. "I'll call the school, fill out the papers to homeschool, and—" "No, please," Aslan whispered. She put her hand over Graham's hand. She took the pen and wrote, "I'm not sure what they want, but I don't want to hide." Then she said, "Please, let me try it this way. I'll be careful." At first, Graham stared at Aslan as if there were answers hidden under the skin that she could see if only she looked carefully. Aslan willed herself to look as reassuring as possible. Finally, Grams wrote, "Stay away from them as much as you can. Remember the rules." Aslan nodded. She didn't often try to hide things from Grams, but she wasn't going to admit that she'd tried to follow them or tell her about Seth's research. Grams had always insisted that avoidance was the best and only plan. Aslan no longer thought that was a good answer. If she was honest, she never thought it was. She simply said, "I'm being careful. I know what's out there." Grams frowned and gripped Aslan's wrist briefly. "Keep your cell phone in your pocket. I want to be able to reach you." "Yes, Grams." "And keep me updated on your schedule in case—" Her voice broke. She wrote, "We'll try your way for a few days. Wait them out. No mistakes." Then she started tearing the paper into tiny pieces. "Go on. Get something to eat. You need to keep your wits about you." "Sure," Aslan murmured as she gave Grams a quick squeeze. "Wait them out?" Aslan wasn't sure that was possible, even if Grams knew that they were court fae, or if Grams knew that they were court fae, Aslan would be on lockdown. She'd bought herself a little time, but it wouldn't last. I need answers now. Hiding wasn't the answer, and neither was running. She wanted a normal life. College, a relationship, simple things. She didn't want all of her decisions to be based on the whims of fairies. Grams had lived that way, and she wasn't happy. Aslan's mother hadn't even had a chance to find out if she could have a normal life. Aslan didn't want to take either of their paths. But she didn't know how to make it any different either. Fairies, court fairies, didn't stalk a person for no reason. Unless she found out what they wanted, found out how to undo whatever had caught their attention, she doubted they'd be going away anytime soon. And if they didn't go away, Aslan's freedom would. That wasn't an option she liked. At all. After grabbing a quick bite, Aslan retreated to her room and closed the door. It wasn't a sanctuary. It didn't reflect her personality like Seth's house or Rian's too-girly bedroom. It was just a room, a place to sleep. Seth feels more like home. Seth feels like home. There was some things that mattered to her in her room, some things that made her feel connected. A poetry book that was her mother's. Black and white prints of photos from an exhibit in Pittsburgh. Grams had surprised her that day, authorized ditching school and taken her to the Carnegie Museum. It was great. Beside those prints were some of hers that Grams had blown up for her birthday one year. One shot of the railroad yard still made her smile. She started taking photos to see if fairies would show up on film, since she saw them when she looked through the lens. Would they show up on film? They didn't. But she enjoyed the process of taking photos enough that she's glad she tried the experiment. It wasn't much, though. The proof of her personality in the room. It's only glimpses. It felt like that sometimes. Like everything she revealed or did had to be pre-planned. Focus. Control. She turned out the lights, crawled into bed, and pulled out her cell. Seth answering on the first ring. Miss me already? Maybe. She closed her eyes and stretched. Everything okay? He sounded tense, but she didn't ask why. She didn't want to talk about anything bad, any worries. Tell me a story, she whispered. He always made the bad things seem less awful. What kind of story? One that'll make me have good dreams. He laughed then, slow and sexy. Better give me a rating for that dream. Surprise me, she bit her lip. I know better. She really needed to stop flirting with him before she crossed a line that she couldn't back away from. He didn't say anything for a minute, but she could hear him breathing. Seth? I'm here. His voice was soft, hesitant. Once upon a time, there was a girl. Not a princess. No, definitely not. She was too smart to be a princess. Tough, too. Yeah? Oh, yeah. Stronger than anyone realized. Does she live happily ever after? Shouldn't there be something in the middle? I like to read the ending first. She waited, curled up on her bed, to hear his assurances, to believe, for a minute at least, that everything would be okay. So did she? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a few minutes. She heard the sounds of traffic, his breathing. She'd fallen asleep like that before, just holding the phone while he walked home, feeling that connection to him. Finally, he said, "Did I mention how sexy she was?" She laughed. She was so unbelievably beautiful that he paused, and she heard the unmistakable screech as he opened his door. And this is the part where the rating changes. You're at home? She could hear him moving around, door closing, keys clanking on the counter, his jacket dropping, probably on the table. I'll let you go then. What if I don't want you to? He asked. She heard the music as he walked toward his room, some sort of jazz. Her heart sped up, thinking of him getting stretched out on his bed too, but her voice only sounded a little off when she said, "Good night, Seth." "You're running again, then?" One of his boots thudded on the floor. "I'm not running." Then the other boot hit the floor. "Really?" "Really, it's just..." She stopped. She didn't have anything that would finish that sentence and be honest. "Maybe you should slow down so I can catch you." He paused, waiting. He seemed to do that more and more lately, making statements that invited her to admit something dangerous to their friendship. When she didn't answer, he added, "Sweet dreams, Ash." After they hung up, Aslan held the phone in her hand. Still thinking about Seth. It would be a bad idea. A really, really bad idea. She smiled. He thinks I'm smart and sexy. She was still smiling when she fell asleep. Chapter 11. When Aslan walked up the steps to Bishop O.C. the next morning, she saw them. Fey things lingering outside the door, watching everyone and seeming strangely serious. Inside were more fairies, clustered at the doorway to the principal's office. What the fuck? They usually avoided school, whether from the rows of steel lockers or the abundance of religious artifacts she didn't know. Both, maybe. By the time she reached her locker, the presence of fairies overwhelmed her. They weren't to come here. There were rules. This was supposed to be a safe place. Miss Foy? She turned. Standing beside Father Myers was one of the fairy that she was supremely unprepared to face. Keenan, she whispered. You know one another? Father Myers nodded, beaming now. Good. He turned to the two other, equally visible fairies, standing beside him. If she glanced at them quickly, they looked like they weren't much older than her, but the taller of the two had a strange solemnity that made Aslan suspect he was old. He had unusually long hair for such a serious demeanor. Under his glamour it glittered like thick silver cords. A smallish black sun tattoo was visible on the side of his throat, exposed by the tightly plaited hair. The second fairy had almost shorn wood brown hair, and a face that would somehow. The second fairy had almost shorn wood brown hair, and a face that would be somehow forgettable but for the long scar that ran from his temple to the corner of his mouth. Father Myers assured the fairies, Aslan's an honor student, and her schedule is the same as your nephew's. She'll be help getting him caught up. She stood there, trying not to bolt, refusing to look at Keenan, even though he watched her expectantly, while several more fairies walked up behind Father Myers. Readjusting. One of the ones whose skin looked like bark, crackled and grayish, caught Keenan's gaze. He gestured at the others who were fanned out in the entrance and said, All clear. Miss Foy? Aslan? Father Myers cleared his throat. She looked away from the retinue of fairies that had invaded Bishop O'Connell. I'm sorry, Father. What? Can you show Keenan to calculus? Keenan waited, a battered leather bag over his shoulder, looking at her attentively. His uncles, Father Myers, watched her. She had no choice. She forced her fear away and said, Sure. Wait them out? Not likely. Every rule she'd lived with that kept her safe, they were all failing her. By midday, Aslan's control of her temper was steadily being worn away by Keenan's false humanity. He followed her, talking, acting like he was safe, like he was real. He isn't. She shoved her books into her locker, scraping her knuckles in the process. Keenan stayed beside her, an unwanted shadow she couldn't shake. They watched each other, and she wondered again if it would hurt to touch his metallic hair. The copper strands glistened under his glamour, compelling her attention despite best efforts. Rand stopped and leaned hard against the row of closed lockers. The clang made people pause to stare. I heard he was edible, but Rand put a hand on her chest as if she was having trouble breathing and looked at Keenan, slowly and appraisingly. Damn. Definite finesse. I wouldn't know, Aslan blushed, and I'm not going to either. Whatever the weird compulsion was to touch him, she was stronger than any instinct. Just focus. Leslie and Carla joined them as Rand pushed off the wall of lockers. She stepped closer to Keenan and examined him as if he were a slab of meat on a plate. Bet you could. Carla patted his arm. She's harmless. Aslan grabbed her books for the afternoon classes. Her friends shouldn't be talking to him. They shouldn't be in her space. He shouldn't be in her space. And he definitely shouldn't radiate that inviting heat, making her think of lazy days, of closing her eyes, of relaxing. Control, focus. She could do this. She had to. She sorted her things, so what she'd need to take home was on the top stack in the locker. When the day ended, she'd be ready to make a quick getaway. With a forced smile, she shooed her friends away. I'll catch up. Save me a seat. We'll save two. You can't let that, Rand waved her hand at Keenan, morsel wander around unsupervised. One seat, Ree. Just one. None of them turned around. Rhiannon waved her hand over her shoulder dismissively. After a steadying breath, Aslan turned to Keenan. I'm sure you can figure out lunch without help, so, go make friends or whatever. And she walked away. He sped up to stay beside her as they entered the cafeteria. May I join you? No. He stepped in front of her. Please? No. She dropped her bag into the chair next to Rhiannon's things. Ignoring him and the stares that they were attracting, she opened her bag. He hadn't moved. With a shaky gesture, she pointed. The line's over there. He looked at the throng slowly progressing to the vats of food. Can I get you something? A little space? A flare of anger flashed over his too beautiful face, but he said nothing, just walked away. She wanted to believe that she'd get rid of him by her refusal to be drawn in by his attention. I can hope. Because if not, she didn't know what she would do. He was compelling, pulling her attention away from all that she knew was wise and good. As far as the side of the cafeteria, Rhiannon had left her spot in line and was talking to him. They both looked over at her, Rhiannon smilingly, conspiratorially, Keenan looking pleased. Great. Aslan unpacking part of her lunch, pulling out a yogurt and spoon. Stalker Fairy has a new ally. While she was alone, Aslan made a quick phone call to request the cabbie she and Seth had met at the tat shop a few months ago. The cabbie had told them how to get Ditchpatch to send him specifically and assured them that he'd be on time or get a friend to be there if they requested him. So far, he'd been good to his word. She kept her voice as low as she could in hopes that Keenan's guards couldn't hear her. One of them was already moving closer to her. Too late. She hid her brief smile. Any success against them was a pleasure as she disconnected. She stirred her yogurt and wondered yet again why Keenan had singled her out. She knew it wasn't about the sight. She'd lived by the rules, done everything right. So why me? All day girls had tried to talk to him, offered to show him around. He was polite, but admitted that he needed Aslan to show him around, not them. Pretty girls, cheerleaders, geek girls, everyone was lusting on him. It felt good to be the only one they all looked at with envy for a change. It'd feel better if he were a normal guy, like Seth. Along with half the students at the school, Keenan's fairies watched them, unabashed as the Fae always were. They seemed tired, shifting in and out of the school in small groups. Although the metal-laden building must be painful for them, they stood alert and observant, keeping Keenan in their sight at all times. They treated him reverently. Why wouldn't they if Keenan is a fairy king? She thought for a heartbeat that she was going to be sick from the flood of tears and horrible images that came rushing over her. A fairy king, and he's stalking me. With no small effort, Aslan managed to push down the rising worries as Leslie and Carla headed her way. Panic wouldn't help. A plan was what she needed. Answers were what she needed. Maybe if she had answers, if she knew why he'd fixated on her, she could find a way to get rid of them. As she watched Keenan walk toward her, Aslan saw a fleeting image of sunlight rippling over the water, bouncing off buildings, strange flickers of warmth and beauty that made her want to run toward him. He looked at her, smiling invitingly as he followed Rhiannon through the crowded cafeteria. Rhiannon was chattering animatedly to him, looking for all the world like they were long-lost friends. Leslie laughed at whatever Keenan said, and Aslan realized that her friends had all accepted him. And why wouldn't they? As much as she had wished they would ignore him, there was nothing she could say. She couldn't explain why she'd wanted him gone. She couldn't tell them how very dangerous he was. It wasn't a choice she had. Sometimes that lack of choices, the pressures of dealing with the Fae, made her feel like she was smothering. Like the secrecy was a physical weight bearing down on her. She hated it. After her traitorous friends brought him to the table, she tried to ignore him. It worked for a while, but he kept watching her, directing most of his comments to her, asking her questions. All the while he sat on the opposite side of the table, staring at her with those inhuman green eyes. Finally, he pointed at the over-steamed green beans and asked something inane, and she snapped, "What? Too common for someone like you? Where's my control?" More and more, her lifetime of emotional control seemed to be faltering, sliding away. He was frighteningly still. What do you mean? She knew better than to provoke a fairy, especially a fairy king, but she barreled on. You'd be surprised at what I know about you. And you know what? None of it impresses me, not one little bit. He laughed then, joyous and free, like the anger that flared in his eyes hadn't existed. Then I shall try harder. She shivered in foreboding, in a sudden longing, in some uncomfortable mixture of the two. It was worse than the simple compulsion she'd felt to reach out toward him. It was the same disquieting tangle of feelings she'd felt at comics when you'd first spoken to her. Leslie whistled softly. Give him a little something, Ash. Drop it less. Aslan fisted her hands in her lap under the table. PMS, Rhiannon nodded, and then she tapped Keenan's hand and added, Just ignore her, sweetie. We'll help you wear her down. Oh, I'm counting on that, Rhiannon, Keenan murmured. He was glowing, like a bright light radiated from inside his skin as he spoke. Aslan could taste Rose's heavy air, could feel the too tempting warmth from him. Her friends stared at him as if he were the most amazing thing they'd ever glimpsed. I am so screwed. Aslan stayed silent until it was time to go to afternoon classes, her fingernails digging in small half circles, like slivers of the sun, into her palms. She concentrated on the pain of those suns, only partially visible in her skin, and wondered if she had any chance at all of escaping from Keenan's attention. By the end of the day, Keenan's proximity had grown intolerable to Aslan. A strange warmth seemed to permeate the air when he stood close to her, and after a few moments it was near painful to resist touching him. Her mind told her to, but her eyes wanted to drift shut. Her hands wanted to reach out. I need space. She learned to deal with seeing the Fae. It was awful, but she did it. She could do this too. He's just another fairy. She concentrated, repeating the rules and warnings in her mind like a prayer. A litany to keep her focused. Don't stare, don't speak, don't run, don't touch. She took several calming breaths. Don't stare, don't speak, don't run, don't touch. Don't react. Don't attract their attention. Don't ever let them know you can see them. The familiarity of the words helped her push back the edge of desire, but it wasn't enough to make it anywhere near comfortable to be around them. So when they walked into lit class and one of the cheerleaders offered him an empty seat, a seat gloriously far away from hers, Aslan gave the cheerleader a big smile. I could kiss you for that. Thank you. Keenan flinched at the phrase. The cheerleader stared back at Aslan, not sure if it was a joke or not. Seriously, thank you. Aslan turned away from the less than pleased Keenan and slid into her seat, grateful to have respite, however brief it was. A few minutes later, Sister Mary Louise came in and passed out a stack of papers. I thought we'd take a Shakespeare break today. Appreciative murmurs greeted her, quickly followed by groans when people saw the poetry on the handouts. Ignoring the grumbling, Sister Mary Louise scrawled a title on the whiteboard. La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Someone in the back muttered, Poetry and French. Oh, joy. Sister Mary Louise laughed. Who wants to read about the beautiful woman without pity? Utterly unself-conscious, Keenan stood and read the tragic tale of a knight fatally entranced by a fairy. It wasn't the words that had every girl in the room sighing, it was his voice. Even without glamour, he sounded sinfully good. When he was done reading, Sister Mary Louise seemed as stunned as the rest of them. Beautiful, she murmured. Then she pulled her gaze away to drift over the room, pausing on the typically vocal students. Well, what can you tell me? I've got nothing, Leslie murmured from across the aisle. Sister Mary Louise caught Aslan's eye expectantly. So after yet another steadying breath, Aslan said, She wasn't a woman. The knight trusted something inhuman in a fairy or vampire or something, and now he's dead. Sister Mary Louise prompted. Good, so what does that mean? Don't trust fairies or vamps, Leslie muttered. Everyone but Keenan and Aslan laughed. Then Keenan's voice cut through the laughter. Perhaps the fairy wasn't at fault. Perhaps there were other factors. Right. What's one mortal life? He died. It doesn't matter if the fairy, vamp, or whatever it was felt bad or didn't mean to. The knight's still dead. Aslan tried to keep her voice calm and mostly succeeded. Her heartbeat was another matter entirely. She knew Keenan watched her, but he stared at Sister Mary Louise and added, "The monster's not suffering, is she?" "It could be a metaphor about trusting the wrong person, right?" Leslie added. Good, good. Mary Louise added several lines to the scrawl on the board. What else? The discussion veered towards several other topics until Sister Mary Louise finally said, "Let's take a look at Rosardi's goblin market for a moment, and then we'll come back to this." Aslan was unsurprised that Keenan volunteered to read again. He had to know how good his voice sounded. This time he stared straight at her as he read, barely glancing at the words on the page. Leslie leaned toward Aslan and whispered, "Looks like Seth has competition." "No." Aslan shook her head and forced herself to hold Keenan's gaze as she answered, "No, he doesn't. There's nothing Keenan could offer me that I want." Her voice was low, but he heard her. He stumbled briefly, confusion flitting across his too beautiful face. He stopped mid-poem. Aslan looked away before he could see how tempted she really was, before she admitted to herself how much she wanted to ignore all reason. Sister Mary Louise stepped into the silence. "Cassandra, please continue from there. Please let him go away." Aslan didn't glance his way once for the rest of the class. Afterward, she all but ran from the room, hoping the taxi would be waiting as promised. If she had to face much more of Keenan's attention, she was afraid of what she might do. Chapter 12. When Danya walked into the library, she saw Seth, Aslan's friend, the one who lives near the den of steel walls. It wasn't quite late enough to see Aslan, but if Seth was here, perhaps Aslan was meeting him again. He didn't seem to notice anyone around him, despite the mortals and fairies who were all noticing him. And why wouldn't they? He was lovely. Tempting in ways so different than Keenan. Dark and still, shadows and paleness. Don't think of Keenan. Think of the mortal. Smile for him. She took her time, moving slowly and carefully, with a casual hand for support on the vacant tables as she passed. A moment's pause to catch her breath. At the new book display, he watched. "Let him speak first. You can do this." Her gaze, hidden behind dark glasses, lingered on him for a breath or two. He sat at one of the handful of computer terminals, a pile of printouts beside him. When she was beside the desk, she smiled at him. He folded his pile of papers, effectively hiding what he'd been researching. She tilted her head, trying to see what he was reading on the screen. He clicked on something on the screen and flicked off the monitor, pointed at her. "Danya, right? Ash didn't introduce us last night. You're the one who helped her?" She nodded and held out a hand. Instead of shaking it, he lifted it and kissed her knuckles. "He has my hand." It didn't burn like Keenan's touch. She froze, like a quarry before the hunt, and felt foolish for it. "No one touches me." As if I still belonged to Keenan. Forbidden. Leslie swore it would change when the new Winter Girl took the staff, but that was hard to believe sometimes. It had been decades since anyone had truly held her. "I'm Seth. Thank you for what you did. If anything happened to her..." For a moment he looked fierce enough to rival Keenan's best guards. "So thanks." He still had her hand. She trembled as she pulled it from his grasp. He's hers, just like Keenan is now. "Is Ash here?" "Nope. She should be on her way from school soon." He glanced past her to the clock that hung on the wall behind her. She stood indecisive for a moment. "Did you need something?" He stared at her, as if he would like to ask her a different question. She pushed her dark glasses further up the bridge of her nose. Looking past him where several of Keenan's girls stood listening, she smiled wryly. "Are you Ash's..." She waved her hand in the air, somberly as he prompted. "Ash's what?" "Beau?" she said, then winced. "Beau. No one says that anymore. The years sometimes blurred, the words and the clothes and the music, it all rolled together. Her boyfriend? Her beau?" he repeated. He poked his tongue ring at the bottom of in his bottom lip. Then he smiled. "No, not really." "Oh." Catching an unusual scent, Danya sniffed slightly. "It can't be." Seth stood and picked up his bag. He stepped close to her, a hand's breadth from her, as if he were trying to make her step back, asserting some sort of male dominance. That doesn't change over the years. She stepped back, just once, but not before she caught the slightly acrid scent of recently handled verbena, not overpowering, but there, it is, in his bag. Underneath it were the sight of slight scents of chamomile and St. John's wort. I look out for her, you know. She's a wonderful person, gentle, good. He slung his bag over his shoulder and stared down at her. If anyone tried to hurt her, he paused, scowled, and continued. There's nothing you wouldn't do to keep her safe. Right. Glad I could help with that the other day. Distracted, she nodded for Bana, St. John's wort. What's he doing with those? Those were chief among the list of herbs thought to give a mortal fairy sight. Then he left, trailed by several of Keenan's girls. I wonder if they'll notice what he carries in his bag. She doubted it. Once the door swung shut behind Seth and the summer girls, Donnie sat down at the terminal and pulled up his search history. Fairies, glamour, herbs for seeing, Summer King. Oh, she whispered. That couldn't be good. When Keenan got to his loft on the outskirts of the city, Niall and Tavish were waiting. They lounged as if they were relaxing, but he didn't miss the assessing looks they gave him when he walked in. Well, Tavish asked as he muted the television, silencing the weather report about a freak hailstorm. Bria must have heard that I spent the day with Aslan. She often snarled over any progress he made with the mortal girls, but she couldn't, by any rules of the contest, actively interfere. Not great, Keenan was loth to admit it, but Aslan's resistance was wearing on him. She doesn't react as they usually do. Niall flopped into an overstuffed chair and grabbed a controller for one of the game systems. Did you ask her out? Already? Keenan picked up a half-eaten slice of pizza from the box on one of the geode tables scattered around. He sniffed it and took a bite. Not too old. Isn't that too soon? The last girl. Niall glanced up from the TV. Mortal habits change faster than ours. Try a casual friend's approach. He doesn't want to be her friend. That's not what the girls are for. Tavish insisted on his usual stiff manner. He turned and held out a hand for the box of leftover pizza. You need protein, not that. Why you two insist on eating mortal food is beyond me. Because I've had to live for so long among them? But Keenan didn't want to say it. He handed over the pizza and sat down, trying to relax. It was easier here than most places I'd lived. Tall, leafy plants dominated every possible space in the loft. A number of birds flitted through the room, squawking at him and retreating to nooks in the columns that supported the high ceilings. It made the room seem open, more like being outside. So, casuals what they like now? It's worth a try, Niall said, his attention still on the screen. With a muttered curse, he tilted to one side and then the other in the chair, as if that would make the on-screen image move. It was hard to believe that he could speak more languages than a fairy ever would need. Give him a toy and he was hopeless. Or perhaps try aggressive. Tell her that you're taking her out. Something like that. Tavish turned with one of the green concoctions he was forever insisting Keenan drink, and nodded approvingly. That sounds more fitting. Well, there you have it. Sure wisdom on which to try. Niall paused and shot a grin at Tavish. Casual. Indeed, Keenan laughed. How is this amusing? Tavish sat the green protein drink on the table. His lengthy silver braid fell over his shoulder as he moved. He flicked it back with an impatient gesture, a telltale sign that he was agitated. He didn't let his temper slip, though. He never did anymore. When's the last time you dated? Niall asked, still not looking away from the screen. The girls are more than adequate company. Niall interrupted. You see? He's rusty. I am the Summer King's oldest advisor, and Tavish stopped himself, sighing as he realized that he was that he was only underlying Niall's point. Try the boy's advice first, my liege. And with the impeccable dignity he wore like a comfortable cloak, Tavish retired to the study. Keenan watched him go with more than a little sadness. One of these years he's going to strike you for belligerence. He is still Summer Fairy, Niall. Good. He needs to find some passion in his old bones. Niall's humor fled, replaced with the cunning that made him every bit as important as Tavish in advising Keenan these past centuries. Summer Fae are made for strong passions. If he doesn't loosen up, we'll lose him to Sasha's high court. The search is hard on him. He longs for what the court was like under my father. Feeling every bit as somber as Tavish, Keenan let his gaze drop to Park across the street. One of his Rowan men saluted. Glancing back at Niall, Keenan added, what it still should be. Then woo the girl. Fix it. Keenan nodded. A casual approach, you say? Niall came to stand beside him at the window, staring down at the already frost-laden branches. More proof that they didn't stop Maria's ever-growing power. It would be many more centuries until the summer fae perished. And show her an exciting night, something different, something unexpected. If I don't find her soon. You will, Niall assured him, repeating the same words he'd been repeating for almost a millennia. I need to, and I don't know if... Keenan drew a steadying breath. I will find her. Maybe this one. Niall merely smiled. But Keenan wasn't sure either of them believed it anymore. He wanted to, but it became more difficult each time the game was played out. When the Summer Queen bound his powers, making him unable to access much of the summer's strength, freeing the earth steadily, she'd also begun crushing the hope of many of his fae. He might be stronger than most fairies, but he was far from the king they needed, far from the king his father had been. Please let Aslan be the one. Chapter 13. After the taxi dropped her at the railroad yard, Aslan paced outside Seth's door. A few fairies stood nearby watching her, talking among themselves. They never stayed long so close to the old train cars and lengthy tracks, but others would come and replace them. Since Keenan had first spoken to her at comics, fairies seemed to gather wherever she went. She pays too much attention to the mortal boy, a lanky fairy with bird-like limbs grumbled. The Summer King oughtn't put up with it. Times are different, said one of the female fairies. Like the others, she had flowering vines creeping over her skin, but unlike them, she wore a slate-covered suit instead of the sort of girly outfit the others seemed to prefer. Her vines started around her neck and snaked through her ankle-length hair, making her somehow seem both wild and sophisticated. She goes into his home every day. The bird-thin fairy circled the female fairy like a predator. What's she doing in there? I know what I'd be doing, she said. With a sly smile, she reached up and grabbed his face with both hands. Might as well, in this case, if she ends up with Keenan for eternity. Eternity? Aslan turned her back so they couldn't see her face. She paced back across the dead grass, close enough to hear the fairies, but not close enough that they could find it odd. With Keenan for eternity? The female fairy pulled the bird-like one down toward her until they were nose to nose and added, Doesn't matter what she's been doing, though. She's changing already. She licked from the tip of his nose to his eye, becoming one of our court. Let the girl have her fun with the mortal while she's still able. It won't matter soon. Where the hell is Seth? For the fourth time, Aslan pulled out her cell and hit 2 on speed dial Seth's number. It rang behind her. Stabbing the end button, she returned. Relax, Ash. He was walking toward her, holding out the now silenced cell, strolling obviously past the fairies. Where were you? I was worried that something... He lifted an eyebrow. That you forgot. She finished weakly. I know better. Forget you? He looped an arm around her middle and steered her forward. Opening the door, he motioned for her to go inside. I'd never forget you. The bird-like fairy skittered over, sniffing Seth and wrinkling his nose. Answer your phone next time, please. Aslan poked Seth in the chest. Where were you? He nodded and followed her inside, closing the steel door in the fairy's face. I was talking to Dania. What? Aslan felt like her throat was closing. Not terribly friendly, prettier than I realized, though. Seth smiled calmly, like he hadn't just told her that he'd been chatting up one of them. Not so pretty that I didn't tell her to watch her step, but still, she's almost as pretty as you. You did what? Aslan shoved Seth gently, but he still winced. Talk to her. He put a hand on his chest where she'd touched him and shoved him. He pulled his shirt and looked, a puzzling expression on his face. And he said, that stung. She might seem nice, but she's still one of them. You can't trust them. Aslan turned to stare at the fairies loitering outside. One of them, the girl in the suit, was sorting a handful of leaves, folding them like origami. Seth came up behind her and rested his chin on her head. How many are out there? Too many. She turned so she was facing him, chest to chest, too close to glare up at him. You can't do stuff like that. You can't risk... Relax. He caught a length of her hair in his hand, letting it slowly sift through his fingers. I'm not an idiot, Ash. I didn't say, nasty fairy, stay away. I thanked her for her help the other day and mentioned that it would be bad if anything happened to you. That's all. He stepped back so he could look down at her upturned face. There were dark circles under his eyes. Trust me, okay? I'm not going to do anything that would put you in more danger. Sorry. Feeling guilty for yelling, for doubting, for the shadows under his eyes, she took his hand and squeezed. Sit down. I'll make tea. I made some progress in the research on fairy sight and fairy defense. Not a lot, but some. He settled into his favorite chair and pulled out a sheaf of papers. When she didn't answer, he laid the papers in his lap and asked, "Or did you want to tell me what's got you so spooked first?" She shook her head. No, not now at least. All the talk of fairies, research on fairies, avoiding fairies, how fairies that did. I thought we could try talking about something else for a while. I don't know. He rubbed his eyes. Okay. Do you want to tell me about school? Definitely not going to talk about school if we're going to avoid discussing fairies. She filled the tea kettle and opened the chamomile tea on the counter. Holding it up, she asked, "Does this taste awful?" "I don't think so, but there's honey in the bottom cupboard if you want it." He stretched, exposing Bear's stomach where his shirt lifted, flashing at the black ring in his navel. "We could talk about after, when life gets back to normal." I was thinking we should go out to dinner when this is all over. She'd seen him without a shirt before, seen him in his shorts, but they'd been friends for a while. What did he say? Dinner? Dinner with Seth. She stood in his kitchen watching him toy with the ring in his lip. It wasn't quite that he was biting it, but sucking it into his mouth. He did that when he was concentrating. It isn't sexy. He's not sexy, but he was, and she was staring at him like a fool. Wow, she whispered. She looked away, feeling stupid. We're friends. Friends go to dinner too. It doesn't mean anything. She opened the cupboard. The bottle of honey sat next to an odd assortment of spices and oils. Dinner, right. Carla wants to go to the new place over on Vine. You could... Wow, huh? His voice was low, husky. His chair creaked as he stood. His footsteps seemed strangely loud as he closed the couple of yards between them. Then he was beside her. I can work with WoW. She turned away, quickly, squeezing the bottle and squirting honey on the counter. I didn't mean anything. Too much flirting lately. And that call, and I know you probably have a dozen girls waiting, and I'm just tired, and hey. His hand was on her shoulder, trying to turn her to face him. There's no one else. Just you. No one else for the last 7 months. He tugged gently on her shoulder again. There's no one but you in my life. She turned and they stood there. She stared at his shirt. There was a button missing. She clutched the bottle of honey until he pulled it out of her grasp and set it down. Then he kissed her. She stretched up on her tiptoes, tilted her head, trying to get even closer. Seth slid a hand around her waist and kissed her like she was the air, and he was suffocating, and she forgot about everything. There were no fairies, no sight, nothing. Just them. He lifted her onto the counter where she'd sat and talked to him countless times, but this time her hands were in his hair, wrapping her fingers in it, pulling him closer. It was the most perfect kiss she'd ever had until she realized, Seth. This is Seth. She pulled away. Definitely worth the wait, Seth whispered, his arms still around her. Her legs were on either side of him, her ankles crossed behind him. She rested her forehead on his shoulder. Neither of them said anything. Seth doesn't date. This is a mistake. It'd be weird after she'd been telling herself that for months. It hadn't made her stop thinking traitorous thoughts. She lifted her head to look at him. 7 months? He cleared his throat. Yeah, I thought if I was patient. I don't know. He gave her a nervous smile. Not at all like himself. Hoped you might stop running away. After all that talking and time, I need to deal with this fairy thing in 7 months? She felt awful. Seth's been waiting for me? 7 months. He kissed her nose, like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. Then he gently lifted her off the counter and stepped away. And I'll keep waiting. I'm not going away. I'm not letting them take you away. I don't know. I didn't know. She had so many questions. What did he want? What did waiting mean? What did she want? None of those things were things she could ask. For the first time, that was what she could think of. She was more than comfortable thinking about fairies than anything else. I need to deal with them right now, and I know I don't want you to ignore them, but I just don't want you to ignore this either. He brushed back her hair and let his fingers linger on her cheek. They've been stealing mortals away for centuries, but they can't have you. Maybe it's something else. I haven't found anything to suggest they go away once they find a mortal they like. He pulled her into his arms, tenderly this time. We're one up since you can see them, but if this guy really is a king, I don't think he's going to take no very well. Aslan couldn't say anything. She just stood there in Seth's arms as he gave voice to her growing fears. By the end, chapter 14. By the end of the week, Aslan was sure of two things. Being with Seth had become beyond tempting, and avoiding Keenan was utterly impossible. She needed to do something about both situations. The Fairy King could navigate the school just fine, but he still trailed her like a particularly devoted stalker. There would be no waiting him out, and her careful attempts at callousness and indifference were proving futile. She could barely stay upright by the end of the day, exhausted by the sheer effort of not touching him. And she needed a new approach. Fairies chase. That's the rule, at least. Seeming unchanged, like the lupine fae that prowled the streets, Keenan was chasing her. She might not be physically running, but it was the same thing. So even though it terrified her, she decided to stop, to let him think that he could catch her. In her childhood, that was one of the hardest lessons. Grams used to take her to the park for short trips so she could practice not running when they sniffed and chased, so she could practice making her sudden stops seem normal, uninfluenced by the fairies chasing her. She hated those lessons. Everything inside her screamed run faster when they chased, but that was fear, not reason, compelling her. If she stopped running, they lost interest, so she'd stop running from Keenan when she figured out how to make it seem somehow natural. She'd tried a few tentative smiles at Keenan as they walked toward health class. He responded without hesitation, directing such an intensely happy look at her that she stumbled. But when he reached out to study her, she flinched away, and a frustrated frown returned to his face. She tried again after they left religion class. So did you have big plans this weekend? The expression on his face was an odd one, somewhere between amused and surprised. I'd hoped to, but... He stared at her until she felt that familiar panic and compulsion rise up. I've been doubting that I'd have much luck. Don't run. Her chest hurt too much for her to offer an answer, so she just nodded and said, "Oh." Silent then, he looked away, but he was smiling and quiet now. He waded through the crowd without another word. He still stayed too close, but the silence was a nice change. The lack of tempting warmth was incredible, like some odd calm radiated from him. When they walked into government, he was still smiling. "Can I join you at lunch?" She paused. "You have every other day." He laughed, a sound as musical as the chiming song of the lupine fae when they ran. "Yes, but you resented it every other day." "What makes you think I won't resent it today?" "Hope. It's what I live on." She bit her lip, considering. He was too easily encouraged by a few friendly remarks, but when he wasn't trying so hard, she seemed able to breathe around him, felt less overwhelmed by the odd compulsions. Tentatively, she said, "I still don't like you." "Maybe you'll change your mind if you spend more time with me." He reached out like he'd touch her cheek. She didn't flinch, but she tensed. Neither of them moved. "I'm not a bad person, Aslan. He stopped and shook his head. She knew she was walking on precarious ground, but it was the closest to honest that he'd sounded and the closest to peace that she'd felt since he'd started attending Bishop O.C. She prompted, "What?" "I just want to get to know you. Is that so strange?" "Why? Why me?" Her heart sped as she waited for him to respond, as if he'd answer the real question. Why not someone else? He stepped closer, watching her predatorially, his mood shifting rapidly once more. "Honestly, I don't know. There's just something about you. From the first time I saw you, I just knew." He took her hand. She actually let him, playing along. It wasn't just playing, though. She'd been resisting the need to reach out to him since they first met. It wasn't logical, but it was definitely there. At his touch, her sight sharpened. It appeared as if the fairies around them had all donned human glamours simultaneously. No one in the classroom reacted. No one screamed. Obviously, the fairies hadn't suddenly become visible. What happened? She trembled. Keenan was staring at her too intently for comfort. I don't know why certain people shine for others. I don't know why you and not someone else. He gently pulled her forward and whispered, but it's you I think of when I wake each morning. It's your face in my dreams. Aslan swallowed. That would seem odd, even if it were normal, and he wasn't. What he was, unfortunately, was completely serious. She shivered. I don't know. Keenan stroked her hand with his thumb. Give me a chance. Let's start over. Aslan froze. Years of Graham's warnings tumbled through her mind, a symphony of wisdom and worry. She heard her own voice telling Seth the way things were done wasn't working. Try something new. She nodded. Start over. Sure. And he smiled at her. Truly smiled. Wicked and lovely, and so tempting that the stories of fairy kidnapping came crashing into her mind. Kidnapping? Following by choice is more like it. She all but collapsed into her chair. He's a fairy. Fairies are bad. But if I can find out what they want. Class was half over before she realized she hadn't heard a word of the lecture, or she glanced at the notebook she didn't remember opening, written any of it down. Afterward, still in a daze, she walked beside Keenan into her locker. He was talking, asking her something. Carnival? I could pick you up or meet you. Your choice. Sure, she blinked, feeling like she was sleepwalking in someone else's dream. What? The fairy guards exchanged knowing looks. There's a carnival tonight. He held out a hand for her books. Stupidly, she started to hand them to him, but stopped herself. What about your big plans? Just say yes, he waited expectantly. Finally, she nodded. As friends. He stepped back and closed her locker. As she closed her locker, of course, friends. Rianne, Leslie, and Carla came over then. Well? Rianne prompted. Did she say yes? She shot him down, didn't you, Ash? Leslie patted Keenan's arm consolingly. Don't worry, she turns everyone down. Not everyone. Keenan looked entirely too pleased with himself. We're going to the carnival. What? Aslan looked from Rianne to Keenan. They knew? Pay up. Rianne held a hand out to Leslie, who grudgingly pulled a crumpled bill out of her pocket and then turned to Carla. You too. Pay up? Aslan echoed, following them toward the cafeteria. Behind her, she heard several guards laughing. I told them he'd be able to get you to go out. Rianne folded her winnings and tucked the bills in her blazer pocket. Look at him. He's right here, Ree, Carla murmured, shooting Keenan an apologetic look. You've tried to teach her manners, but she shrugged. It's like housebreaking a dog. If we had her when she was still a puppy, maybe. Rianne smacked her on the arm, but she was grinning. Woof, woof. Turning to Aslan, Carla lowered her voice. When we saw you two talking, she wouldn't let us come over until she was sure he had asked you. She actually grabbed Leslie. It's not a date, Aslan muttered. Right. We're just going to talk, get to know each other, Keenan agreed. He paused, looking at each of them, glowing just a little as he did it. In fact, you can join us if you want. Meet some of my old friends. Aslan's heart sped. No. Sounds like a date to me. Don't worry, I'm not coming on your date, Ash. Rianne sighed. Like something wonderful had just happened, and turned to Carla. What do you think? Carla nodded. Definitely a date. Aslan is accompanying me as a friend, Keenan said with a contented look. I am simply honored that she's joining me at all. Aslan looked at him, as her friends were staring at him adoringly. He caught her gaze and smiled. She didn't speed up as he kept pace with her. Now that Keenan seemed pleased, the compulsion she'd been feeling had faded to barely a whisper. I can handle this. But as he pulled out her chair with an unusual courtly gesture, she saw her reflection in his eyes, surrounded by a tiny halo of sun. I hope. Chapter 15. When Dania returned home from her evening walk, Berea was waiting on the porch, reclining in a chair fashioned of ice. Almost idly, the Winter Queen sculpted streaming faces on a sheet of ice beside her. It looked like the fairies in the sculpture were trapped alive, writhing and shrieking. Dania, darling, Berea gushed, coming to her feet with such grace that it looked like she'd been pulled upright by invisible strings. I was beginning to wonder if I should send Agatha after you. The hag in question grinned, exposing gaps where a number of her teeth should have been. Berea, how very... Dania couldn't find a word that wouldn't be a lie. Unexpected? Pleasant? No, neither of those. What can I do for you? Such a good question, that one. Berea tapped her chin with one finger. Now, if only my son had the good manners to ask that, Berea frowned prudently. But he doesn't. Across the yard, at the edges of the trees, several guards saluted. The Rowan man waved. Do you know what that boy did? Danya didn't answer. It wasn't a question, really. Just like Keenan, it'd be a relief not to be stuck between them. He went to the girls' school, enrolled there like a mortal. Can you imagine? Berea began pacing, the staccato rhythm of her steps cracking like the falling sleet on a battered porch. He spent the week with her, trailing behind her like that dog of yours. Wolf. Sasha's a wolf. Wolf, dog, coyote, whatever. The point, Berea paused, standing so still she could have been carved of ice. The point, Dania, is that he's found an inn. You understand what that means. He's making progress. You are not. You're failing me. Agatha cackled. Berea turned slowly, deliberately. She crooked a finger. Come here. Not yet realizing her error, Agatha stepped into the porch with her grin still in place. Is it amusing that my son could win? That he could undo everything I've built? Berea put one finger under Agatha's chin, her long manicured fingernail cutting into the hag's skin. A line of blood trickled down her throat. I don't find it the least bit funny, Aggie dear. It's not what I meant, my queen. Agatha's eyes widened. She glanced at Tanya, imploring, Aggie, Aggie, Aggie. Berea tisked. Tanya won't help you. She couldn't, even if she wanted to. Tanya looked away, staring inside at the ever-present Rowan man. He shuddered in sympathy. They had all seen Berea's temper before, but it was still awful. Holding the hag tightly in her embrace now, Berea put her lips to Agatha's withered mouth and blew. All the while, Agatha tried to escape. Her hands pushed against Berea's shoulders, clutched at the Winter Queen's wrist. Sometimes the Winter Queen relented. Sometimes she did not. Today, she did not. Agatha fought, but it was futile. Only another monarch could stand against Berea. Well then, Berea murmured as Agatha's body slumped forward, limp and Berea's embraced. Agatha's spirit, a shade now, stood beside them, wringing her hands and weeping soundlessly. Berea licked her lips. I feel better. She dropped Agatha's body to the ground. Agatha's shade knelt beside her now lifeless body. Ice crystals fell from the corpse's open mouth, trailed down her sunken cheeks. Go on now, Berea shooed the soundlessly weeping shade with a gesture, like she'd brushed off an insect. Then, when she turned to Dania, work faster, girl. My tolerance wears thin. Without waiting for an answer, Berea walked away, the shade of Agatha trailing behind her, leaving Dania to deal with the corpse in the porch. Dania stared at Agatha, at the body that used to be Agatha. The ice had melted, leaving a puddle soaking in the hag's hair. That could be me. It will be me someday if I fail Berea. May I help? The Rowan man stood close enough that she should have known he was there long before he spoke. She glanced up at him. His gray-brown skin and dark green leafy hair made him almost a shadow in the dark. If it weren't for his bright red eyes, he'd almost blend into the growing evening. Evening? How long have I been standing here? She sighed. He gestured to the other guards, who waited back in the tree line. We could take her with us. The soil is moist. Her shell would fade quickly in the loam. Dania swallowed. The sickness threatened to rise. Does Keenan know yet? She whispered, embarrassed that she still worried over how he felt. Skelly already went to tell him. Dania nodded. Skelly? Which one is he? She tried to focus, think about the guardsman, better than thinking about Agatha. Skelly, he was one of the court guards, thin, like the Scrimshaw sisters, gentle. He'd wept when she'd frozen guards before. Still, he stayed, taking his turns guarding her, doing as Keenan ordered. Do you need extra guards? The Rowan man did not wince when he offered, although she knew he remembered the temper tantrums she'd thrown when such a thing was offered in the past. We could at least come closer. Frozen tears rolled down her face and landed in the puddle on the porch. I don't weep for her. Would he still offer me such kindness if he knew that? Even now, with Agatha at my feet, I weep for myself. She looked away, to where the other guards stood, waiting ready to protect her, even though she'd never shown them a single reason to do so. Of course they would. Keenan wills it. Dania? She looked up. That's the first time you've said my name. With a soft, rustling sound, he stepped into the porch. Let us take her away. Still watching him, Dania nodded. He motioned to the others. In barely a moment, they'd taken the body away, leaving only a giant wet spot where Agatha had lain. Closing her eyes as if she would shut out the images, Dania drew several deep breaths. Should I stay closer? The roan man whispered. Just one guard nearer to you. If she returns, eyes still closed, she asked, What do they call you? Evan. Evan, she murmured. She's going to kill me, Evan. But not tonight. Later. If I let the new girl take up the staff, she'll kill me. And I'll join Agatha. She opened her eyes and held his gaze. I'm afraid. Dania, please. No. She turned away. She won't be back tonight. Only one extra guard? He held an arm as if to pull her into an embrace. If you were harmed, Keenan would get over it. He has a new girl. She'll give in. We all do. She folded her arms over her chest and turned to go back inside. Back still turned, she added softly, Let me think. Tomorrow I'll figure the rest out. Then she went inside and closed the door, calling to Sasha, burying her face in his soft fur and trying to breathe. Keenan was in great spirits when he got home. The guards had already filled in Niall and Tavish, so he wasn't surprised to see them smiling when he walked in the door. Almost record time, Tavish nodded approvingly, holding out a glass of summer wine. I told you. Nothing to worry over. Mortals are like that, especially these days. Go, get her in line, back to business. Get her in line? Niall laughed and poured himself a glass too. I'd love to see you say that to a mortal girl. Tavish scowled and carried the decanter to the living room. Several cocktails perched on a long tree branch that spanned the left side of the room. I've spent centuries with the summer girls. They were mortals, and they're not that complex. Niall turned to Tavish and slowly, as if the older fairy were a very, very young child. Once they're summer girls, their inhibitions are gone. Remember Eliza when she was immortal? Not the least bit affectionate. He took a long drink and sighed. Now she's much more receptive. Aslan's different. Keenan interrupted, feeling immeasurably angry over the idea that Aslan could be like Eliza, could join the summer girls, could warm other fairies' beds. I can feel it. She could be the one. Tavish and Niall exchanged a look. They heard the self-same words before, and he knew it. She could be, though. She could be the one. He dropped onto the sofa and closed his eyes. I hate this. How damnably important these games are. I'm gonna go grab a shower, clear my head. Relax. With a solemn expression, Tavish topped off his glass and handed it to him. She might be the one. One of them has to be, sooner or later. Right. Keenan took the glass of wine. If not, I'll spend eternity doing this. Send a couple of the girls. I could use some help relaxing. A couple of hours later, Keenan looked at the clock for the third time in the past half hour. 2 more hours. This was the first time his people would see them together. The first chance they had to see him speak with the girl who might be the Summer Queen. The girl who might change everything. No matter there had been others. It was always the same. That precious bauble of hope. That this one could be his queen. Niall leaned against the wall in the doorway in the bedroom. Keenan? Keenan held up a pair of gray trousers. Too formal. He rummaged in his closet. Jeans. Black ones. She'd like that. It was quicker if he simply became what they wanted. Made a few changes to act the way they found appealing. I need black jeans. Not new looking, but not too faded. Right. Niall passed the message on to one of the summer girls. When she left, he came further into the room. Keenan? What? Keenan found a t-shirt he didn't remember owning. He pulled out a dark blue shirt, silk from the Desert Spiders. Much nicer. He could only change so much. The mortal boy that Aslan, he'll be gone soon. Keenan slipped off his shirt and put the new one on. Then he looked through the jewelry the girls had brought over earlier. It was nice to have a gift handy if things went well. Mortal or Fae, they liked that sort of thing. I'm sure he will, but in the meantime, the tiny heart seemed nice. Too personal? Too soon? The sunburst was a nice choice. He set it aside while he looked through the others. After tonight, he'll be busy elsewhere. Why? I asked the girls to find someone to distract him. He's in the way. He picked up the gold sunburst. Later, it'll mean more to her if she's the one. Slipped it into his pocket. The sunburst it is. Alright, and that's where I'm going to end for tonight, because the next several series of chapters are very good to read all together, because it gets, from like halfway through the book, from like this point forward, it gets very hard to stop reading. It gets very sequential, intense, and good. So that's where I'm ending for tonight. Hope you guys enjoyed it.